Elne Kommes, Haynt is yortsayt. Yortsayt, Haynt, a Zind. Wenn gerufen hat zu dir ein erstgeboren Kind. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schmeichel über Wald und Plain. Jeder hat Haynt yortsayt, noch sein Schwell, noch sich allein. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Regen 1943, noch ein letzten Karschenbäum und Schwellballe dabei. Haynt is yortsayt, noch mein Zeit, verfreuren in Ponar. Haynt is yortsayt, noch mein Mames gellen Samovar. Noch ein Schnee von meinen Weißlen ausgeschneit, beschaß ich hab zugedeckt mit dem Käfer von mein Gas. Haynt is yortsayt, noch die 2 Malochen bei mein Bett. Haynt is yortsayt, noch ein Zoffenstern ergetät. Yortsayt noch ein Spiegel mit einem blauen Teich im Rahmen, wo es bäumten sich die Licht und Schottens von meinem Stamm. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schabbes, rein wie ein Brillant. Haynt is yortsayt noch der Fiddle in mein Chavers Hand. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Leib in fredigen Antbläus. Haynt is yortsayt noch der letzte yortsayt Licht in Kleus. Yortsayt noch einen langen Säger auf der Wand von Lehm. Oi, noch alle Wieglieder von unser Irrverein.
God of vengeance, today is yortsayt. Today we mourn the day you were summoned by your firstborn. Today we mourn a smile which covered dell and wood. Today we mourn ourselves, our home, our neighborhood. Today mourn the rain in 1943, the last little swallow in the nearby cherry tree. Today I mark a time frozen in Pinar. Today I remember my mama's yellow samovar. The snow which the whites of my eyes have shed and which covered my street, now the graves of my dead. Today I mourn the 2 angels by my bed and the North Star somewhere overhead. I mourn the mirror with its lake blue frame where bathed the light and shadows of my roots, my name. Today I mourn a Sabbath, pristine and grand. Today I mourn the fiddle in my comrade's hand. Yortsayt for a body joyously in bloom, and for the last votive in the shul's small room. It's yortsayt for the tall clock upon the whitewashed wall, and for every lullaby, generations all.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marvin Schiff. I'm the president of the Toronto Workmen Circle Foundation, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to our commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on this, the 78th anniversary of that historic event. I think it's safe to say that most of us are at least passingly familiar with the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. But for those who may not be, let me just say that the uprising occurred in April 1943, 2 years after the Nazis had forced the Jews of Warsaw and neighboring communities into the ghetto, and later sealed it off, leaving its inmates isolated from the city and condemned to suffer Nazi brutality, starvation, disease, and death. On the first night of Pesach, though, members of the ghetto's Jewish fighting organization armed themselves with weapons smuggled into the ghetto and rose up against their Nazi overlords, firing the first shot in the uprising. It was, as even the participants knew from the start, a hopeless undertaking. Yet even today it stands as one of the most heroic battles for human life and dignity in all of history, or as the late US President John F. Kennedy once called it, an inspiration to the free world. And so, as a tribute to the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto and similar sites of Nazi oppression, the Toronto Workmen's Circle Foundation presents these yearly programs of prose, poetry, and song. But above all else, these annual gatherings are about remembrance. That is, not just remembrance for its own sake, but also remembrance of what the ghetto experience 8 decades ago continues to mean to us in our own times, in our own circumstances. For the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto and other such horrific constructions cannot be allowed to have suffered and died to no other purpose than to satisfy Nazi anti-Semitic bloodlust. With their last breaths, those Jews urged us never to forget them and their fate, of course, but not just to honor them, but because if we forget, we become complacent as Jews and risk losing what we've gained. And how much more timely could such a warning be than it is today? For over the years since the Holocaust, Jewish communities in many parts of the world have gained so much. They've grown and prospered. Their people have achieved respect and prominence in a wide array of fields in the sciences, politics, in the arts. But at the same time, so many of us have become self-satisfied, comfortable, complacent about our place in society, while at the same time, blatant anti-Semitism has re-emerged. Incidents of often deadly violence against Jews have increased significantly. Neo-Nazis bearing signs with anti-Semitic symbols and slogans march openly in street demonstrations. Synagogues, Jewish cemeteries, and other such sites are vandalized. These spectacles of evil have even moved local politicians to speak out. Our own mayor of Toronto, John Tory, has acknowledged that, quote, anti-Semitism is a sad but real part of our history. Despite our efforts, acts of polarization and discrimination have increased again, close quote. And Amsterdam's mayor, Femke Halsema, has declared that, quote, we're all responsible for what is happening now. We should not be silent bystanders. So we're heartened by your presence with us this afternoon and hope that we can take it as a demonstration of your commitment to what we might call active remembrance. The urge not just to remember, but to take action where we can to beat the forces of current day anti-Semitism and other forms of race hatred and give meaning to those two glowing words, never again.
Die Bix ist nicht gewesen der Träum von seiner Nacht und nicht von seiner Tag der Sivik und Bescheid. Noch hat der Heuben sie zu jener größer Schar von Volk, von eigenem, die Kedusche und die Leid. So hat sie Schritt begleitet als Sockens letzter Blick, so hat sie behielt bewacht, am Mutters letzte Träer. Und seine Hand geworden ist gebencht mit Keuch und Haft, und sie sah Fläschelnaft gewinn, das grausamste Gewehr. Von der Yeshivas seien sie gekommen, von Droh, von Hechalutz, von Medemschulen, von Fabriken und Werkstätten, Kinder, was noch Nächten haben sich gespielt in Samt, alte Leid, was haben schon gehabt, Tachrichem zugegräht. Jetzt haben sich gelernt werfen Ziegel und Granaten. Und alles herum ist so fremd und säunedig und weiß. A viele in Kaczerginskis Park, von jener Seite von Meuer, während die grüne Bäume wie mundierte SS-Leid stehen auf der Wache herum dem Ghetto teuer. Und alles verrot, die Schein, der Wind, die Nacht, der Schochen. Und Judas ist a jede Gas, a jede Schwell und Stein, was war verkauft, für 30 Silberling zum Mörder, dein Mammen und dein Schwester, dein Träum und dein Gewehen. Hat mehr zu keinem nicht gehaft, nicht auf gar nicht mehr gewahrt. Wenn's hat verklungen zu der Welt der letzte SOS, und wenn's hat keiner nicht geämpft auf den letzten Ruf, hat aufgeflammt durch Blut, durch eigenem der Ness. Bloß zu der Meire-Seite, zum Misrach-Seite, zu Zoffen und zu Dorm hat man sich gewendet in jener Schau von Einsamkeit und Neud, wie einzukarben die zerbeuen Himmel, Stein und Bäume. Wir alle gehen sich frei, mit Schadach sein, mit Teut. Der Brand von Ghetto hat versenkt die Wies von der Sonne. Sie soll die Augen nicht verdecken, nur sehen, als müssen sehen und müssen Ede sagen, Jahr nach Jahr, von Dor zu Dor. In jener Tag, auf dem Ort, also ist es geschehen. Nicht doch kein Wort, was soll Gott auf eine Rege, sie können aufmannen zurück von jener Heuch. Von dort, wo sie die Eingewickelte in Flammen, die Eingewickelte in Pfannen und in Räuch, haben zum letzten Mal gebencht die Erde mit offenem, mit jednem Blick und Himmeln aufgeprallt wie teuren zu Glik. Nicht doch ein Wort, was soll sie aufmannen zurück? Nur du, mein Herz, ob kennst du, geh sie noch, und wer war seiner letzten Träum, der Hemmschach und die Weg.
Heylik, Heylik, 10-mal Heylik seinen See in unser Zar. See, was liegen zerteiligt in Treblinke und Ponar. See, was seinen umgekommen in Retziche und in Spott, zärtlendig auf sehr Gummen, dem verschämten Nomen Gott. Zum Teut gegangen willig, ausgeschöpft Bein und Heut, wie es wollte nicht sein, kein Heylik, welcher Weg es führt zum Tod? Was heißt Leben in der Ghetto? Wer von dem weiß heint dem Teitsch? Nacht mit meiste Mäusgebette, Tag und Schein in Pein verbeitscht, ausgeschmiert in Blut und Tränen in dem Schotten von dem Tod, hat man kinderlach gelernt, Hilf gebracht zu die in Neut. Jeder eine hat gegeben Hilf und Preis den Teutentoll, weil zu leben, überleben, ist gewesen der Parol. Was heißt in der Ghetto leben? Weißt wer heint dem Teich von dem? Als ein schwarzer Teut daneben hat Eisleisung gewähnt. Als ein strikt zusammen Kappel hat gemoniert und geschleppt. Doch hat man den Weg gezappelt, sich gemattert und gelebt. Und darüber komm ich melden und erklären, jung und alt, als gelebt hat man wie Helden, nicht nur kämpfendig im Wald, weil den Ghetto überkommen bloß ein Tag in Zwang und Gewalt hat gefordert mehr am Mune, wie zu sein ein Jahr im Wald. Und darüber lassen wir beugen unser Kopf, verseh in Zahl, und mit Tränen in die Augen sich der Monnen sehr gesah. Und nicht losen, aber wemmen, was ist nicht gewesen dort, sehr Heiligkeit verschämen, mit nicht ein abgehitten Wort. Weiß, als nicht nur mit Gewehren kann man leben wie ein Held, euch in Schweiß, in Blut und Tränen kann man sterben wie ein Held.
In April 1943, the members of the Warsaw Ghetto Jewish Fighting Organization took up the arms they'd been able to smuggle into the ghetto and launched the ill-fated Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But the uprising was not the first act of resistance to the brutal Nazi oppression the Jews of the ghetto had been suffering for so long. Resistance of another, far more subtle form had been going on almost from the day the ghetto was established. And today, we're privileged to welcome as our guest speaker one of the most active and influential figures in the American Jewish community to tell us about it, Samuel Norich. Mr. Norich, as many of you may know, is the president of the Forward Association, the not-for-profit publisher of The Forward and the Yiddish Vorwärts, the latter of which celebrates its 124th anniversary this year. During his two-decade tenure as chief executive, the Forward Association's publications broadened their reach, raised their already acclaimed journalistic quality, and took the lead among American Jewish publications in meeting the challenges and capitalizing on the opportunities of digital media. From 1980 to 1992, Mr. Norich was executive director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the world's preeminent institution devoted to the documentation and study of the modern history and culture of European and American Jewry. He's the author of What Will Bind Us Now, a report on the institutional ties between Israel and American Jewry. And from 1975 to 1981, he served as a vice president of the World Jewish Congress, the youngest person ever to have been elected to that position. Born in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1947, the son of Polish Jews, Mr. Norich immigrated to the US with his family in 1957. He was educated at Columbia University in New York, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and at the University of Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Samuel Norich.
By Toga Levaye, by Nachta Konzert, the role of culture in ghetto resistance. I'd like to thank my friends in the Toronto Workmen Circle Foundation for inviting me to take part in this year's communal act of remembering the Kedoshim, who perished at the hands of the Germans and their helpers, Yimach Shemam. It was June 1981. With 6,000 others, I was in Jerusalem for the World Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, scheduled for 36 years after the end of World War II and the liberation of the last Nazi concentration camps. 36 years because that was twice high. I was asked to give the keynote address for children of survivors living in the diaspora. Rivka Miriam, a young poet, was asked to give the keynote address for children of survivors living in Israel. I remember what happened right after our speeches more vividly than I remember what Rivka Miriam said or even what I said. As soon as our session ended, we were both ushered outside the conference hall to a waiting van from Israeli radio, where they had set up microphones to interview us. The first question the reporter asked me was, "Can you tell me, why did they go like sheep to the slaughter?" I was dumbstruck. The implication of his question was clear. He was talking about the vast majority of European Jews under Nazi rule who did not take up arms to fight the Nazis. Further, the implication was that all these Jews lacked the courage, the self-respect to resist. Indeed, that taking up arms against the Nazis and killing some of them was the only way to vindicate the honor of the Jewish people. That without this kind of vindication, there was something shameful about the way the vast majority of European Jews perished. There was another implication as well, that Israelis would not have been so passive, would have fought, would not have allowed the genocide to happen. His question was like a gut punch. I was emotionally exhausted from the speech I had given a few minutes earlier and shocked that the reporter would so brazenly ask such an offensive question. I wanted to slap his face. I didn't. But I also didn't respond to him as I should have. I just said, you know nothing. You understand nothing. And turned around and walked back into the conference hall. To be sure, there was a grain of truth in what the reporter had said. Indeed, most of the Jews herded into the ghettos by the Nazis did not take up arms against their murderers. But just as surely, they were not without agency, without a will, initiative, ingenuity, courage, persistence, and daring. They demonstrated those traits by their individual and group actions, as diarists and chroniclers, as poets and writers, as street singers and musicians, in choral groups and orchestras, as theater performers and organizers, as teachers and librarians and historians, and yes, in some times and some places, as fierce and effective fighters. They demonstrated it in staying alive, if they could, in keeping family and neighbors and chaverim alive, if they could, in keeping their own and other people's spirits up, in doing what they could to stay who they were for another day, another month, another year, despite all the odds. It's on the cultural initiatives that took place in the Warsaw Ghetto and, by comparison, in the Lodz and Vilna ghettos that I want to focus in this talk, because that was the clearest expression of who they were. No cultural project initiated in the many hundreds of ghettos of wartime Poland, Lithuania, the Soviet lands, Hungary, and Romania tell us more about the life of the tormented Jews living and dying in them than the Oyneg Shabbos archive created in the Warsaw Ghetto, conceived and led by Emanuel Ringelblum. Carried out in secret from the time of its launch in November 1940, when the ghetto itself was established, until the tens of thousands of documents it compiled by the spring of 1943 were buried under ghetto buildings, in metal milk cans and in tin boxes. The project collected everything from diaries and artwork to tram tickets, accounts of refugees from other towns and cities deported to the Warsaw Ghetto, proclamations by the German-appointed Jewish Community Council, by underground fighters, research studies of hunger disease by Jewish physicians, sociological studies of Jewish-Polish relations, ethnographic accounts of smugglers who supplied most of the ghetto's food, studies of corruption, of religious observance, of the ghetto police, of women, first-person accounts from the killing centers at Chelmno and Treblinka. Only 3 of the 60 individuals that Ringelblum engaged in the secret archive project survived the war, and they managed to find and rescue 2 of the 3 buried caches of documents, one in 1946 and the other in 1950. The third was never found. While historians have known about these finds since then, it has only been in the last 3 decades, since the end of the communist dictatorship in Poland, that the historians have had access to those records, housed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The 35,000 pages of Oyneg Shabbos documents in the Institute's possession have now been published as 37 volumes, including an English language catalog of the entire collection. So it's only in the last decade or two that scholars in Israel, North America, and Europe have given sufficient attention to the archive's treasures. What the interested public knows about them is largely thanks to the masterful account by Samuel Kassow in his 2007 book, Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum, the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Oyneg Shabbos Archive. Kassow emphasizes that Ringelblum was not only the chief organizer of the Oyneg Shabbos project, he was also one of the leaders of a remarkable social welfare organization in Warsaw, the Eileen, the Jewish Self-Help Society, which ran soup kitchens and house committees that reached down to the many hundreds of apartment buildings with large numbers of Warsaw's 500,000 Jewish residents. Though it benefited from funds provided by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, it also relied on funds and later on donations of scarce food or other goods from the ghetto residents themselves, supporting mutual aid and group solidarity far more than a purely philanthropic effort could have done. As Kassow puts it, thanks to the Eileen, Ringelblum had daily contact with all segments of ghetto society and could recruit the trusted collaborators who would form the Oyneg Shabbos, close quote. When the ghetto was established in November 1940, Ringelblum and a group of intellectuals also created ECOR, the Yiddish Cultural Organization. Its initial task was to teach Yiddish to the middle-class Jews, most of them Polish speakers, who worked in the Alleinhilfe, so that they could speak to the impoverished Jews and refugees deported into the ghetto, most of them Yiddish speakers. Within a few months, quote, IKOR's role expanded from teaching languages to becoming a major cultural institution dedicated to creating a thriving and attractive cultural life. The IKOR organized dozens of public gatherings to commemorate the great Yiddish writers Mendele Moichat Sforim, Peretz, and Shalom Aleichem. It collaborated with the house committees in the Warsaw Ghetto to organize theater performances and poetry readings. IKOR offered Yiddish activities for ghetto children, puppet shows, skits, and morning readings devoted to children's literature. IKOR organized a Jewish People's University. It printed Yiddish textbooks for ghetto schools. Various ideological groups created underground schools affiliated with Tzisho, the Central Yiddish School Organization, which was secular and socialist, Tarbut, Zionist and secular, Shul Kult, Yavne, Zionist and Orthodox, Choreb, Beth Jacob, and others. Underground newspapers, journals, and miscellaneous volumes were published in the Warsaw Ghetto. A central library for children was organized by Bashe Temkin Berman, and a symphony orchestra under the leadership of Shimon Pullman performed regularly. Other large ghettos, such as those of Lodz and Vilna, also managed to create an intensive and varied cultural life. The Lodz Ghetto was a very different place than the Warsaw Ghetto. It was hermetically sealed, with no movement in or out except that overseen by the Germans. It was a ghetto much more tightly controlled by its Judenrat, its Jewish council, headed by Chaim Mordechai Rumkowski, than was the Warsaw Ghetto by its Judenrat, headed by Adam Chernyakov. The Lodz Ghetto was one of the earliest to be established in February 1940 and the last to be liquidated in August 1944, with the deportation of its last 12,000 Jews to Auschwitz. While the Alleinhilfe and the house committees in the Warsaw Ghetto were separate from the Judenrat and even saw themselves as a countervailing force to the Judenrat, Rumkowski so completely dominated everything that happened in the Lodz Ghetto that it was impossible to assert any separate initiative. In Warsaw, 80% of the food consumed by ghetto inmates had to be smuggled into the ghetto. In Lodz, the Germans and Rumkowski controlled everything that came in or out. In Warsaw, once the Ghetto Uprising began on April 19, 1943, a small band of fighters were able to hold off the German army for 4 weeks with the help of ghetto residents who hid them in their cellars and bunkers. In Lodz, there was no armed resistance. But there was an effort to create a written record of life in the ghetto. While the Warsaw Oyneg Shabbos project was done entirely in secret, the archive of the Lodz Ghetto was established by Rumkowski as the department of the ghetto administration. Those who worked to collect documents and testimonies observed limits to what they could do and write, lest their Judenrat superiors put a stop to their work, or worse. There were no such constraints on the Oyneg Shabbos project. The Lodz archive was hidden when the ghetto was liquidated. Most of it survived, was found after the war had ended, and an abridged edition was published in 1984 by my late colleague at YIVO, Lucian Dobroshitsky, as the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto. In the Vilna Ghetto, the archive of documents and testimonials was the work of one man, Herman Kruk, who also kept a diary, both of which survived. The YIVO Institute published a partial version of Kruk's diary in Yiddish in 1961. In 2002, Benjamin Harshav published a more comprehensive version of the diary in English, together with large parts of Kruk's archive, under the title The Last Days of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, Chronicles from the Warsaw Ghetto and the Camps, 1939 to 44. Vilna was also the home of a group of extraordinarily gifted writers and poets, most of them associated with the Jung Vilna group before the war, who wrote some of their most memorable work during the war and of those who survived after the war. This group included Abraham Sutzkever, Shmerke Kaczerginski, Chaim Grade, Lazer Wolf. Kaczerginski wrote songs like the youth hymn and Stiller Stiller that we still sing on commemorative occasions such as this one. Hershl Glik was younger than the others. He wrote the Partizan hymn in the ghetto, Sag nit Keynmol als du gehst den letzten Weg. 3 decades after the war's end, Abraham Sutzkever published a collection titled Poems from a Diary. One of them began, Bei Tag a Levaya, bei Nacht a Konzert, und kommen sei dorten, sei da, is beschert. In Cynthia Ozik's translation, the funeral's early, the concert is late, I go to both, such is my fate. To my mind, what stands out in the record of Jewish cultural effort in the Vilna Ghetto, even more than the community archive and diary compiled by Herman Kruk, more than the poems penned by Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski, was the daring effort over many months to save precious books and documents from Nazi pilfering or from destruction by what came to be called the Paper Brigade in the ghetto. The Nazi regime had created an institute for the study of the Jewish question in Frankfurt and set about confiscating over 5 million books from all over occupied Europe and shipping them to the Institute's warehouse outside Frankfurt. The YIVO building in Vilna was made a selection site to which the great Jewish libraries from the city and its surroundings were brought. 36 Jewish intellectuals, scholars, writers, and journalists were forced to sort through YIVO's own collections and other collections brought there, and to put aside what the Germans wanted for shipment to Frankfurt. The rest was to be incinerated. The slave laborers, Kaczerginski and Sutzkever among them, set about hiding thousands of the most valuable books and documents from the Germans. And as the YIVO building was located outside the ghetto, they would smuggle books and documents through the ghetto gate at the end of each day. In their pockets, wrapped around their bodies, in diapers made for the purpose, or in a toolkit with a false bottom, hidden in a secret compartment underneath the tools. These books and documents were then hidden, at first in the ghetto library, where Herman Kruk was the director, and later in some 10 cellars and attics inside the ghetto, or even given to Gentile friends for safekeeping. If the ghetto gate were manned by the Jewish police and they were searched and found to be carrying anything, they risked a beating on the spot. If they were discovered by German guards, they risked not only a severe beating, but imprisonment or even a bullet to the head. Over the course of 2 years, from September 1941 until August 1943, they managed to rescue thousands of books and documents from German confiscation or from destruction in paper mills. What became of the cultural treasures the Germans did steal and ship to Frankfurt? And what became of the treasures the Paper Brigade managed to rescue and hide? That is a story told by David Fishman in his 2017 book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis. Suffice it to say that what the Germans pilfered was discovered by the US Army in a warehouse in Offenbach near Frankfurt after the war's end, was identified as YIVO materials and shipped to YIVO's New York headquarters in 1947. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski were among the ghetto fighters who sought to mount an uprising like the one in Warsaw. But once the Germans learned of the plans and threatened to kill everyone left in the ghetto, it quickly became clear that the fighters in Vilna did not have the support of the Jewish inmates of the ghetto. Some of the fighters, including Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, managed to flee the Vilna ghetto just before its destruction by the Germans in September 1943, to join Russian partisans in the nearby forests and to return to Vilna with the conquering Red Army in July 1944. They then unearthed most of what the Paper Brigade had managed to hide inside the ghetto. Those treasures went into a post-war Jewish museum under Soviet rule. But the Soviets soon imposed their own constraints on that and on all other Jewish cultural institutions, and by 1949 had closed all of them. The collections of the Jewish Museum had to be rescued a second time, this time from destruction at the hands of the Soviets. And that was done by Lithuanian librarians, again at risk of their lives. For 4 decades, the fate of those collections remained unknown. Unknown to YIVO, now headquartered in New York, unknown to scholars in the West. It was only in 1989, with the advent of perestroika, that we were able to travel to Vilna and were shown some of the remnants of the pre-war YIVO collections. Other YIVO treasures were identified in the months and decades since. And a massive digitization project, now drawing to completion, will finally reunite the parts of the pre-war library and archives of YIVO that are in New York with the parts that are still in Vilna. Reunite them virtually, that is. What do we make of this stunning record of feverish cultural activity in so many places, by so many people? Their motives varied. For some, at some times, performing or listening to a concert was an escape from a terrifying reality. For some, at some times, it even made the unbearable bearable. For some artists, poets, writers, scholars, teachers, doctors, practicing their profession or their craft was a way of holding on to life in spite of what was happening around them. It was a way of contending with hunger, with disease, even with the inevitable death, by continuing to be what they were as individuals and as parts of their families, or immediate community. Ringelblum may have started the Oynek Shabbos archive to document the crimes of the Germans for an anticipated post-war judicial or restitution process. Later, he was collecting evidence of mass killing that he hoped would mobilize the civilized world to come to the immediate aid of the Jews. But it soon became clear that he was documenting the mass murder of all of Polish, indeed of European Jewry. If the Germans accomplished Hitler's aim, who would remain? And what would they know of how European Jewry had lived and how it was murdered? What they did under impossible conditions did not take less courage than taking up arms. What they did deserves to be remembered in the same way as we remember the glorious fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in Białystok, in Sobibor, in Treblinka and Auschwitz and the forests where Jews fought back. They too rescued their honor and ours. They too rescued their humanity and ours. Thank you.
Es brennt, Friederloch, es brennt. Oi, unsere Städten brennt. Diese Winden mit Zirkussen reißen, brennen und zerblasen. Staut am Hoch die wilde Flammen, Hauptsache schon brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt, mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, also ist ihr unser Stempel brennt. Es brennt, Friederloch, es brennt. Und ihre Stempel so scheuen die Feierzucken, das ganze Stimmel eingeschlungen, und die Bässe wippen huschen, unser Stimmel brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt, so ist ihr mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, so ist ihr unser Stimmel brennt. Es brennt, Friederloch, es brennt. Es kann wohl wieder kommen der Moment. Unser Stück mit uns zusammen soll überschaut weg in Flammen bleiben, so wie noch erstarrt, noch küsst der schwarze Wind. Und ihr steht und guckt, so ist ihr mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, so ist ihr unser Stempel brennt. Es brennt, Friederloch, es brennt. Die Hilfe ist noch in euch allein gewählt. Und der Städtel ist euch teuer, nehmt die Kinder, löscht das Feuer, löscht mit euer Regenblut, beweist, dass ihr das kennt.
von die Ghetto-Twisse Wend in die Wälder freie. Anstatt Keten auf die Hand, halt a Bix a Neie. Der Faschist, zittert, hört, weiß nicht wo von wannen, stürmen wie von unterdrehrt, jeden Partizanen. Wenig seien mir in Zoll, dreiste, wie Millionen, reißen mir auf Berg und Tal, Brücken, Echelonen. S Wort ne komme hat a Sinn, wenn mit Blut verschreibst ihm. Fahr dem heiligen Bagin, führen mir die Schreiten. Nein, wir wollen Keynmol sein letzte Mohikaner. Es brennt die Nacht, die Sonnenschein, dem Jid, dem Partizaner.
Ihr zieht mein Treuer wie Yortsayt-Lichter noch euch Martyrer heilige Gesichter. Yortsayt-Licht noch mein Heim. Wie die Gedoschen, ihr seid gestorben, wie mit euch wird leuchten unser Morgen. Ihr wird Keynmol nicht vergehen. Wie der Phönix von die Stäuben, von Asch sich wieder aufgehäuben. Also wird ihr euch gehen. Von die Ovens, von die Flammen, von dritten Huben aufgestanden. Mein Volk wird nicht vergehen. Du, mein Kind, du wirst mich erben, ein Volk darf leben und nicht sterben. Ich schreibe für dir das Lied. Du sollst dem Fordern weiterspinnen, mein Volk soll wachsen und soll grünen. Gedenk, du bist der Jid. Du, mein Kind, von Stammerzweigel, für mein Dor, du sollst nicht schweigen, gedenk die Nazi-Schlang. Unser Volk wird sich zu Zweigen mit neuer Gwure widersteigen in sein Heldengang.
On the first Seder night, April 19th, 1943, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto took up arms against their Nazi overlords. It was the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory, as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of their people. On the walls of the ghetto, they posted an 11th commandment, "Thou shalt not despair." It was their watchword and their legacy. When the battle was near the end, the few surviving Jews issued an appeal to their brethren around the world. Remember us. Do not forget what we have suffered at the hands of our murderers. Let our departure from the world in ashes and in smoke not be in vain. This call, though not immediately heard, was immortalized in scores of writings and sanctified in the annals of the human spirit. It has nourished the will of new generations to renew and fortify their national and cultural heritage. We remember the heroes and fighters who fell in the Warsaw Ghetto and in all the ghettos. We remember the countless acts of unarmed resistance through this terrible period in our history. We remember our families on this, the 78th anniversary of the uprising. We will never forget them.
Es zieht sich durch endlose Deures und zieht, der gewaltige Völkergeschlag. Es zittert das Schlachtfeld mir unter die Tritt, ich gehe mir als weiter mein Weg. Durch Samt und durch Derner, durch Stein und durch Bein, ich gehe und ich will noch ausgehen. Ich hab mit den Sotten Hamaschres allein geschlossen an ewigen Bund. Das Feuer, es soll mich nicht brennen. Das Wasser, es soll mich nicht schlingen. Der Spieß soll mich stechen nicht kennen. Die Keul soll zurück von mir springen. Ich fühle, ich bin stärker von allen Jesuren, von menschlicher Bösheit und Streit, und stärker von Wasser, von Feuer, von Sturm, und stärker afillu von Zeit. Es seien vor mir durch die tausender Jahren die Maluches die Größte gegangen verloren, die Völker die stärkste vertilgt geworden und Weltstädte ackert in Salz. Und riesige Berg seinen lang schon zerschotten und ewige Wälder zerfeult und zertrotten und mächtige Felsen zerweicht und zerknotten. Ich leb und gedeih noch als. Ich leb und ich will noch als leben durch tausende Jahren von Streit. Ich will noch als leben und kämpfen und streben und Temp ist der Zorn von der Zeit.
Die Keynmol hat sich jetzt im letzten Weg. Heute nehmen neue, verstellen neue Weg. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedeckte Show. Es wird ab heute unser Trott, wir sein ein Do. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedeckte Show. Es wird ab heute unser Trott, wir sein ein Do. Bauernland, das Weizenland von Schnee. Wir kommen ran mit unser Kleid, unser Weg. Und ungebaut ist das Stolz von unser Blut. Straßen merkt auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Und ungebaut ist das Stolz von unser Blut. Straßen merkt auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Die Wolken zum Vergilden unser Heim und der Merken der verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur euch versammeln wird die Sonne in den Kajor, die Erfahrung und geben das Leben von dort zu dort. Nur euch versammeln wird die Sonne in den Kajor, die Erfahrung und geben das Leben von dort zu dort. Das Lied geschrieben mit Blut und nicht mit Wein. Es ist nicht ein Leben ohne Freude und Frei. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen und Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hand. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen und Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hand. Versorgt mich Keynmol, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Von Stimmen meine verschnellen neue Weg. Trugen weg nach unser Haus gedenkte